So remember the challenge. There's a microphone roving. While waiting for that first question, factoid, by the way, you might remember, maybe those 7,000 pages, they weren't like on a thumb drive. There were 7,000 pages that had to be Xeroxed at 10 cents a page by Daniel and his kids.
Daniel, I've got a quick question for you that's more personal. You said that when you were talking about maybe going to jail for life, your son was 14 years old. And I'm kind of interested in what kind of conversation you had with your family about this decision that you were going to take about your own life that was going to impact them.
Tell me a little more.
I've got an echo here. Echo.
Given your son 14 years old, what kind of a conversation did you have with your family about this decision?
That is a question I've never been asked in 40 years. That's interesting. And I wouldn't be too eager to tell it, except that my former wife passed away several years ago. It made a lot of trouble in the family for my children, more than I realized at the time. Oh, could you hear me earlier? I wasn't talking up. But I'll tell you. I mean, it's a very good question. Of course, every whistleblower faces this kind of problem. First of all, why did I want my son, who was then, 14, he was 14, to be in on this and all? And the answer was, at that moment, I was going to give, 69 now, Fulbright, the papers starting the following month in November, 69. And I expected then he might put them out without using me. He didn't need to use me, but I told him, look, I have no desire to go to prison, and if you can do this anonymously without involving me, fine, but that is not a condition. And if you need me for any reason, say to authenticate that these really are the Pentagon Papers and here's when they came from and all that, if you want to call on me on that, I'll do it. If there's a reason that it will help things, you can call me. I expected that if he did that, again, I didn't have a lawyer at that point. When I later told a lawyer, he said, well, if you, through Congress, there's maybe a 50% chance they'll go after you if you gave it to Congress, openly. Like, as Vinny tried to do, you might say. But he said, if you give it to the Times, there's about an 80% chance they'll go after you, and anybody else, 100%. In those days, by the way, the Post was not the paper it became after the Pentagon Papers. It's much more of a Washington, D.C. local paper. So I didn't think of anybody but the Times, and they were the only paper I knew that would print pages and pages of this stuff, which is what I wanted. The only condition I put on, which I don't think Neil Shane even passed on to them, but they did it, was that it be handled as a big story, not a one-day story and not one thing. And of course they did do that, about many pages a day. So I felt that I would be in prison, going back to 69 now, within weeks. And I would never see my children again except in a prison yard at best or through heavy glass. So they would be told, and this turned out to be true, that their father had gone crazy, was crazy. And they couldn't say I was always crazy in a way because they'd been hiring me all this time, giving me all this stuff. But that I'd gone crazy somehow, or that I was a traitor, this or that. And I wanted my son, who was old enough, I thought, to appreciate this. My daughter was 10 and going on 11. Too young, I thought, to really understand this. But I wanted him to see that his father was doing something in a very businesslike way. It takes a lot of time to do it, had to be done. I haven't gone crazy. I'm calmly doing what I think has to be done. And that would inoculate them a little bit about what they would hear. And that I thought it was the right thing for the country. And in fact, I got him to read Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience at that time, which has influenced his whole life. He's now, by the way, the editor-in-chief of Orbis Books, the Mary Knoll Seminary books. So that was the idea. And then one night, I had to put stuff in very fast to get it out, another batch. And I left my daughter in the car, saying, "No, just wait for her." She screamed like murder. She wanted to be in on this. So I said, "Okay, come on up." And she sat on a sofa. And then she wanted to be doing something. And it so happens that the scene was burst in on about an hour later with a rap on the door, and there were two policemen outside. This was the second time, actually, this had happened, because the woman, woman Linda Sine, whose office it was, had a habit of turning the key the wrong way, the security key, which would ring the alarm in the police office. So the police came in and found me on the Xerox machine, and Tony Russo, I think, was collating, and my daughter was cutting Top Secret off the top and bottom of the pages with the scissors. We learned to instantly declassify later, if you want to know, by putting strips of paper, of cardboard on the top and bottom of the Xerox screen, and to take out the top secret part, except that the top secret was stamped on and it was irregularly. Some of it was down, and every time I went through the stuff, I found more top secrets that we hadn't yet gotten. But anyway, so that was the scene they came in on. And I told them not to tell, I hadn't meant to bring Mary into this, and I knew that her mother would not like that. And so I urged them not to tell, which they didn't for quite a while. And when it came out, and this was the sad part, my daughter really felt she was in between, you know. It turned out that my wife, this is worth mentioning when we talk about whistleblowers, because whistleblowing puts almost invariable extreme strain on a marriage, whether it's the man or the woman doing it. Somebody who did a study of this said, a book I read, said the average life of a marriage after whistleblowing is 18 months. And nearly all people I know had their marriages destroyed. I was very lucky on that, and in part because at a fairly early stage I brought my wife into it, and she was partners in it and fully supportive of it. And with all these others, you know, they can't tell anybody what they're doing. It's very secret. They don't want their wife or their husband to be involved, you know, in the pre, so they don't tell them. And then it breaks, you know, all this breaks, and they lose their jobs, their clearance, their income. They have to move to a different part of the country. Their children have to lose school and their friends, and they have a problem going to college. And the wives didn't, or the husbands didn't sign on for that, and it breaks up the marriage. And if you've seen, how many people have seen the movie The Insider? Okay, well, the others might well see that, journalists here. You know, that's about Jeffrey Wigand, whose marriage, in the scene in it, the wife says those words, but they're very common. I didn't sign on for this, and she leaves him. And he goes from being the vice president for research of Brown and Williamson Tobacco to being a high school chemistry teacher. And a different way of life altogether. So that's common. Well, I told my wife that I was going to do this, my former wife. We've been divorced for several years. And I told her I was going to do this, and she said, "You can't do this. You've got to pay, you know, alimony and child support." I was giving half my salary to her. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to be in prison." And she said, "Well, you can't do that. You've got a court order." I said, "Well, this is this is going to take precedence over that." And but what I didn't understand was she had been against the war before I was. I'm telling you something I've really never told in public, and I won't go on much longer, but I'll just mention this. She had been against the war when I was in Vietnam, fighting it, pursuing it. So I assumed that although she was very angry that I had involved the children, and I was apologetic about Mary, I really hadn't meant to do that, but Robert, I wanted him to, and I also wanted to give Robert, and this worked for Mary too, who became a Sandinista later, the notion that the day might come when they had to go to prison, that was the right thing to do. I wanted to leave them with that legacy. So I knew that she'd be mad about that, but I thought she would be assumed that she supported what I'd done. Though she didn't show it, you know, but well, I won't go through the whole story, but she acted very strangely from then on, cooperating with the FBI, it so happens. And it took me many years to find out she thought I committed treason. She was her father was a brigadier general, by the way, in the Marine Corps. but she thought this was unpatriotic, treason, criminal, and that I had involved the children not only in publicity that she didn't want, that much I knew, but involved them in a terrible crime. And I didn't realize that. So here were my children, this is so typical of a whistleblower problem, in between their mother at home, and I didn't know this. I would have them for the weekend, and they would go home to a mother who thought that I was a really bad guy, which I didn't know, and she didn't tell me. So my daughter felt very much in the middle on this. And my son went off for a year in England during the trial to get out from all this. My daughter held it against me for a long time, and to a certain extent still. And it was very hard. Well, I won't go into other people's stories, but I can tell you, they have the same story. So when I urge people to consider being whistleblowers, I don't say in terms that the costs are, the risks they're taking are small. I do encourage them, as I say, to do it anonymously now. I would say don't, but I don't know anybody else who did it differently. Nobody went for a trial publicly, or including me. I just couldn't, I knew I couldn't be anonymous. I'll tell you why. Because, which I didn't say at the time, because my former wife had told her stepmother, who went to the FBI. And so they knew what I'd done a year before they came out. But she told them I had given it to Fulbright, which I had, and they backed off, lest they embarrass the Bureau with Senator Fulbright. That's the words they use. Those are the key words in the FBI. Don't embarrass the Bureau. So, as Colleen Rowley will say, that's the first commandment. So they backed off then. So when a year later I put it off, they had something to hide. They'd known this a year earlier. I got, 27,000 pages of my FOIA file. I didn't pay for the next 13,000. I just talked to them last week about that. But somebody called me about something else, and I said, by the way, I wonder if they still have those 13,000 I didn't want to spend $1,300 on at the time. But not a word about the fact that they had me a year earlier in those pages.
Amazing.
Okay. You didn't stop me.
No, it's okay. Why would I have in that case? That was a fabulous story. And I have to say, that's the best father and daughter craft project story I've ever heard in my life. How can you top that one? Next question, please.
They're afraid of getting such a long answer.
There's one, Mr. Albrecht. No, not Mr. Albrecht. Excellent.
Hi, Daniel. Provocative question. We have technology.
Okay, could you go a little bit louder?
Yeah, okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
We have technology and hackers to help us get the documents that are rightfully ours in a democracy. Is that a line we should cross, given what we're up against?
Is that the question? Okay.
We have hackers today who can theoretically help get access to these kinds of documents. Is that a line we should cross?
I'm not aware that people do a lot of hacking into the White House or the Pentagon, or maybe they're able to some limited degree, and obviously that's a case the Justice Department would drool at getting on them. It has this feeling of spying and hurting national security and so forth. You tell me, do you have the technology? The other have the technology to get the Pentagon Papers out of the Pentagon?
But I guess you're saying from a principle perspective,
What?
that is a line that we should cross, or that people would feel comfortable crossing, or not?
Well, I find it, a kind of random sample that a hacker would get. It would be surprising if they really, my first thought is surprising if they really got at hot stuff. Second thought, that's not true. There's so much abuse to discover in there, so much horrible stuff, that they probably would get across stuff. They went into Strat 4, guys in prison for that, and they got quite a bit out of Strat 4. I won't repeat what I was saying this afternoon in full, but I will say that when Chelsea Manning is thought of as having dumped out everything he then, Bradley, could get his hands on. This young kid, unstable and all, transgender, put out everything, just dumped everything he could get at. That happens to be totally untrue. What he had access to was, with his high clearances, higher than top secret, communications intelligence, code word clearances, and top secret, he was in what is called a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. As soon as I read that, I knew, and it turned out to be true, he'd had daily access to top secret, higher than top secret, communications intelligence and so forth, and he chose not to put out any of that, whatever it revealed. In fact, he didn't even put out what is called secret LIMDIS, limited distribution, or no-dis, no distribution, which keeps it down to less than the usual distribution of things. He chose this CyberNet, which had only secret. I'll tell you, when I was in the Pentagon for a year as assistant secretary, I couldn't take time to read anything that was only secret. That sounds funny or arrogant or something. It was not that. I was inundated. I had to have only top secret, LIMDIS or no dis. That was the instructions I gave, and that limited me to 5 feet of paper to go through every day instead of the 11 feet of the other stuff. So the stuff he put out, and he put it out on the assumption he put it out on the assumption that it couldn't be that dangerous, even though he hadn't read it all, because it was only secret. I was surprised at how much stuff there was in that secret stuff about not just gossip, which wasn't very important, but torture, that we were handing over thousands of people to the Iraqis for torture, knowing, which many people said, isn't this illegal? Should we be doing this? Answer, do not investigate further. That's an illegal command under the Geneva Convention. Your obligation is to investigate those cases. That's true of Obama. He could be brought before the Hague Tribunal on that charge because handing people over for torture, knowing it and refusing to investigate is as criminal as torturing them yourself, as a matter of fact. So he saw this. That was all in secret. And I thought, wow, this stuff has gotten so neutralized, we're so, it's not sensitive anymore. You put it down in secret. It also made me think maybe I was missing some stuff back in the Pentagon when I didn't even read any of this stuff. He didn't put out any of the top secret. Remember, one more quote of Obama. When Manning was first put on trial, somebody actually got paid for him by a donor. But somebody was at a table at a fundraiser to ask questions of Obama. It was a $1,000 a seat fundraiser. So this person said, and this is on YouTube, I'm sure you can find this, easy to find on YouTube. The person is asking Obama, didn't Manning do exactly what Ellsberg did? And now, see, I'm the good guy. Yeah, it was as bad as Ellsberg. No, now I'm the good guy because I supposedly was more discriminating. I didn't put out the negotiations, though, for example. I saw that just yesterday in a column. Ellsberg, did it right, and so forth. Of course, I was on trial for a 115-year possible sentence anyway, but now compared to Snowden, I did it right. Compared to Manning, I did it right. I'm a good guy now, which is something I don't accept, that particular honor. So Obama says, so he said, didn't he do exactly what Ellsberg did? And Obama said, oh, Ellsberg's material was classified on a different basis. True. Manning's was all secret. Mine was all top secret. That was the difference. And which, I don't know whether Obama was clear in that. For him to even say it was classified on a different basis suggests that he knew, but what kind of bullshit. So anyway, so it goes. On the hacking, I haven't thought about it. I'd have to think about it. Obviously, we were talking about this afternoon a little bit. Because of NSA and what we now learn, the FBI planes that are dragnetting everything, that's not even NSA. Everybody's doing it. Gathering all the mass, indiscriminate, truly indiscriminate surveillance, which is what Snowden is against, by the way. Snowden is for intelligence, for surveillance, against terrorism, for an NSA existing, etc. for targeted legal surveillance of Americans, and he's actually against mass surveillance even of Germans and even of British and all those. He doesn't think we should be listening to the private conversations of everybody in the world. Now, a lot of Americans would disagree with that. But when it comes to Americans, he says it should be targeted. And he puts that even for Germans, as he said. He said, Angela Merkel, you want to, fine, that's normal intelligence. Everybody in Germany, which is what they're getting, no, he's against that. Okay, so there is a question, what they wanted to get Manning to confess falsely was that Julian Assange had given him spycraft and software that he could insert into the computers and get it out, and get it over to Assange, showing that Assange was no Bill Keller, he was no, and God knows he isn't, thank God for the world, and that he was a spy, see? So you don't have to treat him as a journalist, which we've never prosecuted. We can prosecute him as a spy. That's what they want to get Assange. Obviously, they would do that with a hacker, and they would want to get stuff. The problem is that as of now, journalists have to use spycraft. And somebody this afternoon was telling me that he was at a conference where they were teaching journalists with ex-CIA people how to be intelligence agents against, which is what you've always been. If you're covering the government, you're doing intelligence work against an organization, just like our spies. You may not want to think of it that way because you're so patriotic and you're so with it and so forth, but technically speaking, that's what you're doing. But in the past, you didn't have to be quite that careful about your phone, or you thought you didn't. See, NSA was listening at that time, but you didn't know it. So now you have to know it, and you really have to act like spies. Nobody can anymore guarantee confidentiality and good faith. No one. But you can make your best effort. And Freedom of the Press Foundation is offering to all journalists software called Secure Drop, which will help them do good encipherment, encryption, I mean to say. And that's the kind of thing you have to do now. Well, when NSE sees encryption, they go for that person. They may not break the code right away, but they'll know who they want to follow or who they want to put bugs on, who they want to watch, and so forth. So you're, in a way, tripping them off. But the more people who do it, the less useful that will be to NSA. And to a considerable extent, people will have to use spying techniques to get this, to deal with their sources. And when everybody's doing it, again, it won't prove that they're not journalists. Even Bill Keller, if he was still in the business, would now have to do it. So,
Next question. Joyce? Oh, here. I'll give you mine.
You just mentioned Assange, and I was wondering, Julian Assange, I was wondering if you hold him in the same high regard as you do Edward Snowden.
second.
Do you hold Julian Assange in the same high regard as you do Ed Snowden?
Yeah. These are good. Ask me anything questions. They are more pointed than I usually get, actually, and I'm sure you'll have others. For example, I hold Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning in very high regard. Now, keep in mind that I identify unreservedly with Chelsea Manning and with Edward Snowden. And when I say identify, obviously there's differences in what we did, great differences in personality and background and everything. There's lots of differences you can point to. In terms of what we did, no significant difference. They did now what I would have had to do now, in effect, or I might have done now under their circumstances. I totally admire what they did, which isn't to say that they made no mistakes. And I have criticism of some of the things they did. We can go into that. Now, Assange is, of course, like Bill Keller. That's what I've been. I'm the source, like Manning and Snowden. Assange is a newspaper person. I keep mentioning Bill Keller critically. and that's the way I feel about him, actually, without ever having met him. But for one thing, he went out of his way beforehand to distinguish himself. He said, Assange is not a journalist in any sense that I recognize the term. Well, legally speaking, aside from function, they could not indict Assange unless they'd found that he was doing super spying, which he wasn't. Chelsea Manning, by the way, didn't need any instruction. Chelsea Manning is, by all accounts, the kind of super brain computer nerd like you people, a lot of people here, but maybe even bigger, that Snowden or Assange is. So he didn't need any instruction, it so happens. But a lot of your sources will need instruction on how to do this, and you either give it to them or you go without the story. Okay, so Assange then is on the other side of the line. He's a journalist. He's not a reporter, but he's a computer nerd above all, and a hacker. He believes in hacker philosophy, which I don't fully share. I mean, they're on the spectrum here of full transparency, in a philosophical degree, which I do not share, actually, to that extreme degree. Everything should be out, and so forth. And of course, he doesn't feel that about individual privacy. And that's a hard line to draw, in a way. As everybody knows here, probably, he got furious when people leaked on him in WikiLeaks and so forth. And in fact, dare I say this, but I asked Pierre Omidyar, is he here, by the way? Or not? Well, let's see if I'm speaking out of school here, but I did ask him yesterday how he felt when it leaked that he was dealing with Glenn Greenwald prematurely. I wondered, how did you take that? Weren't you mad? Furious, and so forth. Now, he's not exactly an icon of transparency. Well, I mean, he is an icon of transparency. But when you get leaked on yourself, nobody likes it. And Julian Assange didn't like it. And now, as I say, he's in a different role for me. But when you ask, who was it who asked? You asked, what do I feel about him? I spent 5 days with him in London, putting out the second set of war logs that Manning had given on Iraq. First was Afghanistan. Now, I'll say this. I wouldn't say this except that Assange leaked it, said it somewhere. I was given the opportunity to participate in that first release of the Afghan war logs. And I said, I can't participate in putting out stuff that nobody has read, classified stuff. I said, no, I can't do that. And I felt and said at the time that when they put out the Afghan war logs, remember, which led to the accusation that there was blood on their hands, they'd put out the names of informants and so forth, that it was a mistake. I felt then and still now that it was a mistake for Assange to put on the web all of the Afghan war logs rather than do what he did later, which I thought was the right thing to do. That was to give them to newspapers and let their editorial staffs and their judgment come to bear on what should be released. And he shouldn't do it. You notice that Snowden has insisted, Ed Snowden, have not and will not put out one document. Remember, Manning could have put all his documents on the web. Snowden could have put all his documents on the web. They did not do that. And Snowden's point is, I don't trust my own bias on these things. He's not for total transparency either. He believes there should be secrets, more probably than Assange does. More like what I would say. But he says, but he's biased more toward putting stuff out. He thought this stuff could all go out. He said, but I don't trust my judgment totally. I want other people to use their judgment on what the public needs to know. Now, why these other people? Well, the alternative is to let Clapper decide what the public should know. Between Clapper and Glenn Greenwald, I don't have any problem as to which, or any of the others, Bart Gellman and Laura Poitras and so forth. Clapper, remember the guy who said no to the question by Wyden, are you collecting any kind of data at all on millions or tens of millions of Americans? His answer was no. He later explained when Snowden came out months later with the proof that they were looking at hundreds of millions of Americans. He said, well, that was the least untruthful statement I could make. And as I put this afternoon, I never heard a journalist follow up that question with, General Clapper, Mr. Clapper, he was a former general. What would have been a more untruthful answer, you know? And so Clapper is not the man. It's not his job. It's not his business to decide what the public needs to know. That's not the business he's in. It is the business, it should be the business of the intelligence committees, the oversight committees, when they find illegal activity like torture and simultaneously find that that activity cannot be justified by having any productive consequence whatever, which is what they found about on the torture and the mass surveillance as a part of it. Nothing to justify it, to offset the fact that it is totally unconstitutional and totally criminal. So if an oversight committee is worth anything, Feinstein should be told by your editorial writers and your anybody, columnists, it is not for Feinstein to let the CIA hide its own criminal activity behind a classification that you don't agree with. CIA can make every case to the Intelligence Committee as to why they think this redaction should occur. Feinstein is saying, Wyden is saying, Udall is saying, we don't, the whole committee is saying, we don't agree with those redactions. Well, then they've heard the case. Why is CIA allowed to veto the release of that? Of course it should be leaked if necessary, but what really Feinstein should be told is, it is your job, if you believe the public should know this, which she said she has believed, to put it out. You've heard the CIA, you've done the redaction, you think is appropriate, put it out. They should hear that from newspapers, they should hear that from campaign donors of Feinstein, if there happens to be any in the audience, I don't know. They should hear that. They are not doing their duty. If they kowtow to CIA on a case here which is clearly using the classification system to hide criminal culpability.
We're going to take one more question. Jeff.
Should have been. Oh, there is? Oh, by all means. Yeah.
I'll do two quick ones.
Yeah, this one I think I'll be quick.
Okay,
Daniel,
can we do two and let him get one too? Okay.
all of the major whistleblowers of our time have been men. I wonder why you think that is.
All the whistleblowers of our time have been men. Why do you
That's not the case, actually. Even in the national security community, naturally, of course, in my day, only men dealt with this stuff, except for secretaries. And, you know, I won't name names, but there are journalists who have discovered that, I mean literal secretaries, assistants, you know, so that's a pretty good source. But, and they were all women in those days. Okay, there are women war hawks now in the Pentagon and so forth, and other places. So to start with, of course, we're talking about an area of national security which is very predominantly male to start with. And you can tell me that how many NSA, computer nerds, analysts, my understanding is that women who are very good at this stuff find it a very sexist atmosphere, and they're not welcomed. But anyway, there aren't as many. That's the first point. But second point, actually, is that the word whistleblower used to be very pejorative, actually. It wasn't a good thing. In my day, we hadn't even heard the word. I was not called a whistleblower at that time. Came in later. And even when it came in, Ralph Nader wrote a book about whistleblowers and whatnot. He was one of the first. It was not a good thing. My friend Joe Wilson, the former ambassador to Iraq, whose wife was punished for his whistleblowing by having her name leaked to the press, to Judith Miller and others, Valerie Plame and so forth. Okay, he would never use the word whistleblower. He didn't want the word whistleblower used. He still felt, in my generation, he's younger than I am, but not a good word. And he said, I'm not a whistleblower like Dan and so on. And generally was not a good word. The turning point was a few years ago with the Enron scandal and the others that came out, when 3 women had their pictures on the cover of Time. They were the Women of the Year, Persons of the Year, I think they were called. And Colleen Rowley of the FBI, and two others whose names I forget, one from Enron and one from WorldCom. And actually, Colleen Rowley, and that's a long story, and I work with her very closely now, had been the legal counsel to the FBI office in Minneapolis, and long-term, she retired finally, 30 years, and she was the one who actually revealed that her boss in the FBI and so forth, that they had failed to follow urgent, desperate pleas to examine the computer. I think this is the one who had told his flight instructors that he wanted to learn how to take off in a 747, but it was not necessary to learn how to land. And there was something made them uneasy about that. And that was one of the people who flew into the buildings. And so she revealed that it had been withheld, hadn't acted on it and so forth. But much more than that. That actually, her fellow agents were very supportive of that when she came out with that. Then she wrote a letter to the head of the FBI and to Congress, and that leaked to the press that, with her name, that she believed that the war in Iraq was going to cripple the anti-terrorism efforts since it would recruit so many terrorists. This was the attitude of the head of the counterterrorism in the White House, Richard Clarke, who said, this is a disaster for our counterterrorism. She said that. Her fellow agents all lined up and said, we have lost confidence in her. She had to quit as chief counsel and so forth. She went back to being just a low-level special agent and so forth. She was a real whistleblower, very good example. The other two actually were not by my standards, but I don't want to be picky about this really, whistleblowers in the sense that like Binney and Wiebe and so forth, who went only through channels, they went only to the head of WorldCom and the head of Enron and told them what you're doing is criminal and it's wrong and this is terrible. Not what you're doing, but what your subordinates are doing. They didn't realize that they were talking to the guys who were running these scams, see? So nothing happened. Actually, with those two women, not one shareholder was helped by that, by what they did. It went nowhere. But they were, they did try to complain within channels. My whole point here is that was the first time that said on whistleblowers on the cover. And I really noticed a very big difference in atmosphere after that cover and ever since, gradually. And now with Snowden, I found a real difference. Not so much with Manning, but Snowden, who revealed what they were doing to us, Manning revealed what we were doing to them overseas, and didn't get the interest in this country. But I think there really has been a turnaround, and Snowden feels that there's more and more that what he did may not have been right in all respects. Maybe he put out, he will recognize this, anybody, and certain Assange, and maybe they put out stuff they shouldn't have, that's possible. And maybe they did it wrong tactically. As I say, the fact that Snowden changed his tactics from the Afghan to the Iraq and the state cables, putting out only what the newspaper people put out, showed that he recognized that he had not done it best the first time. And fortunately, I was waiting for a cover of Time magazine to have a headless informant on its cover that could be traced to Manning. But they were, in 4 years have gone by, they have not found one case of somebody actually physically harmed, having said blood on their hands, all this. So I think it's gotten better, and I do hope that newspaper people will do more than they have in the past to recognize the contribution of these sources. I'm not asking for myself now, that's past. In fact, I'm getting great coverage now. I'm the not Snowden, I'm not around. But for them, for people in the future, to recognize that they really are, in their own way, part of the journalistic process, which is crucial to the maintenance of democracy and crucial to avoiding further Vietnams and Iraqs, which we are in the process of being inserted to as we speak by a man that I believe is very reluctant to do it. President Obama, but is being pressed and is doing it in Iraq. We're getting into Iraq the same way we got into Vietnam, not the way we got into Iraq the time before, with an addition of advisors that is creeping in and that is going to mean the ground troops on the ground that General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is calling for, just as the JCS, as I said earlier, were always calling for it in the past secretly. But what the generals learned from Vietnam, don't keep your mouth shut to the public. Tell the public what you're telling the president. And what Dempsey is telling the public right now, who is hearing from the president, no combat troops, no ground troops. And Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, there's no precedent for this, is saying publicly, time and time again, it will be essential to have ground troops. If you can give up, but if you're not going to give up, there's got to be ground troops, maybe 80,000 ground troops. Believe him that that's where he's pressing. And so, you journalists, you can assume with certainty, I'm telling you with my certainty, such as it is, that there are studies going on right now in the Pentagon of the kind I was working with and reading in 1964 and 65, of where the troops will come from, where they will go, what the strategy will be, how many you need, what you need to do in the way of mobilizing reserves, all this studies, while the president is saying, this will never happen. Assume that it is happening right now in press and find it out, and let the public know what they're getting into. And many, like McCain, will say, fine, 80,000, that's not enough, and it isn't enough. You need more, fine, it'll be a debate. But the debate should not go on the basis of, gee, we believe the president, he's the president, he says he's not going to send ground troops, it won't happen. That's not the way America is now. And if it's going to be the democracy that it was meant to be by our founders, where Congress decides whether to go to war or not, which is not the case now, it's really up to you and the sources. Thank you.